Okay, so as everyone knows, well, most of you know anyway, this is a three-part series on the battlefield of consciousness. And last week we did Jacob wrestling, and this week we're going to talk about Rabbi Akiva. As I was preparing this week, I realized that probably do 20 lessons on Akiva, and just became overwhelmed with what am I going to say that relates to this series and also relates to our practice, which is what I'm trying to get across here. Obviously, there are scholars who know more, who've forgotten more about Akiva than I know, but so I've kind of dwindled it down. So for those of you who know a lot about Akiva, don't feel bad that I left out some major things because it's just a lot. I would say to many, he is the greatest rabbi of all time. And certainly to most, he's in the top 10. So just about every special book that we read, uh, passed down throughout the ages, he's contributed to. We're talking the Talmud, the Mishnah, the Midrash. His disciple wrote the Zohar. So, in every commentary, prayer books, otherwise, he's always quoted. So there's certain consequential legacy that he has in Judaism. But what I'd like to do before I connect some of the special things in his life that happened to this topic of the battlefield of consciousness, I just wanted to put into context Akiva's life, right? So he is a first century sage, who first century and part of the second century. So as he comes on the scene, it's a very, very tough time in Judea, in Israel, right, as we know it today. And it's Roman occupation, but even beyond that, it sort of shifted from, maybe Pepsi owns Starbucks. You probably didn't even know that, right? They don't care that it doesn't say Pepsi on the logo. It's Starbucks, right? Well, that's not the way, with Caligula, especially as the emperor, it sort of shifted to everything that we uh, occupy is now Rome. And Caligula thought of himself as a god, right? So between Caligula and Nero and then Titus, there's all of this stuff going on. There's a lot of persecution going on. But it shifts around. Like Nero is after Caligula and a little less, of a god and a little less abusive and a little more tolerant. But he put Titus in charge of Judea, and he was a bit of a beast, pretty much responsible for the destruction of the temple. So all of this is going on. Akiva, there's disputes about his birth. Most feel that he was born around 50 of the first century Common Era. You could say AD, 50 AD. People say maybe it was 30. Um, some people say he lived to be 80. Others say it was 120. I think those who say it was 120 are putting some mystical numerology in there because he's so special. Either way, he lived long for a Kabbalist. Most Kabbalist mystics, for some reason, seem to have a short lifespan. I don't want to go into a list of them. You can look them up. But so he's somewhat famous for having lived a lot longer than some of his peers. Anyway, he was this great guy, and as I said, he contributed to all of these um, great writings that we all reference when we're studying Torah. But his entrance to the scene is very relevant to what we're talking about in this battlefield of consciousness and our lives, right? So he was born to peasant farmers who were converts to Judaism. As a matter of fact, even their conversions, which shouldn't surprise anyone, were called into question by certain people. Because at the time, as it is today, really, maybe worse than as it is today, Judaism was very sectarian. There was a tremendous amount of divisions within the religion, as you could call it, right? So we had Pharisees, we had Sadducees, we had Samaritans, we had Essenes, we had Zealots, we had super zealots, Sicaria. And very often, not only did they disagree, so in today's realm, the sectarianism isn't quite as volatile, I would say. I mean, you have Orthodox, conservative, reform, renewal, all different kinds like that. Then the Sephardic, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi. There's a lot of different things, but mostly we don't hate each other. We respect each other. I would say mostly. I don't know. Maybe I'm being optimistic. Back then, it was a little more sectarian. Lines were drawn a little more vividly, right? So some were pacifist and felt like, while they worshipped one God and one God only and kept halakha and kept Jewish practice, they felt like we should get along with the Romans and their occupation and do the best we can to have peace. Others, on the other extreme, the zealot who were Sicaria wanted to basically kill every Roman they ran across with a knife, and every Jew who was okay with the Romans. So those are extremes, right? And those extremes really muddied the waters of people's lives, right? Because if the Zealots were killing Romans, then it would get back to the Caesar, and Caesar would say, okay, I've had enough of this, start killing Jews, right? So one violent act led to another violent act. Certainly, it started with Roman occupation and Roman oppression, but how it was dealt with was really very different based on the sect you were in. And we have to include the first century Christians as a sect. Now remember, it wasn't a religion, it was part of Judaism, just like the Bar Kokhba people were part of Judaism, just like the Pharisees were, just like the Essenes were. So all this is going on. Akiva's born. He's born to this poor family. They're converts. A lot of Pharisaical people and even others questioned the conversion. Anyway, his parents work for one of the allegedly the richest guy in the whole area. His name was Ben Kalba Savua. And Ben Kalba Savua, his related history is mixed, but basically he was thought of as a good Jewish rich guy. And he owned more property than anybody else. So he had a ton of people working for him. And Akiva's parents worked for him. So he was a shepherd. And there was a big gap between the rich and the poor, just like there is getting more and more today. And we had a situation then where even the religious Jews who were benefiting from tithes and donations, we'll say, from people like Savua, they had a bit of what I'd say, not all of them, of course, painting with a broad brush, an attitude for people that were called or labeled Am Haaretz, right? So the Am Haaretz, literally, that's not an insulting term. Am Haaretz literally just means people of the land, right? but it became a very insulting term. Just like goy. Goyim is nations. It's not literally an insulting term. But when Jew calls a person a goy, there's a little bit of a I'm better than you thing going on, and a lot of people don't like it. A better example may be the Yiddish schwarze. Schwarze actually just means black. So literally, it's not a negative term, but it's become a very negative. So Am Haaretz, to this day, basically people don't think of it as people of the land. They think of it as ignorant people or an imbecile, right? Akiva was very, very upset with that. So he's a shepherd from a poor family working the land of Savua. And he has an attitude not only on the rich at that point in his life, and he's changes a lot through his life, which is critical to this particular topic that we're on, being wrestling in the battlefield of consciousness, that we can change throughout our lives, right? So he resists being called Am Haaretz, and he resists the idea that rabbis are the arbiters of what God wants and what God doesn't want, especially for the Am Haaretz, who are thought of as imbeciles or ignorant people. So all this going on, how do we feel about the Romans? How do we feel about the poor? How do we feel about the rich? There's a lot of division, separations. This is a critical point, right, in the whole story. And I'll bring it back to it at the end, right? So Akiva has some quotes about rabbis that are like, I'll bite their legs off, all this stuff. So he's got a real sort of harsh attitude. And then he's sort of doing his shepherd thing. And being a shepherd seems to lend itself towards some kind of higher consciousness. But he's doing his shepherd thing, and he sees this rock, and he sees this drip, drip of water from a stream hitting the rock. And he sees that over time, the soft water changes the complexion of the rock. It changes the shape of the rock. And he internalizes that and says to himself, wow, I have some harshness going on in here. I'm a little hard. Perhaps like this water, the soft water changing the rock. The flow of consciousness from the Torah and from spirituality and from God, just that flow of consciousness can soften even me. So it's a very reflective moment for him, and it's talked about a lot by the sages, and it's important to the story, because if we go back to this battlefield of consciousness thing, without looking at ourselves as being willing to change and to have the waters of consciousness be unfrozen and pierce through the rocks within us, right? Without that as the beginning or the basis of our wrestling in the battlefield of consciousness, there's no growth possible. And you know that it's just logical, right? So anyway, guess what? It sounds like a romance novel, but the only daughter of Savua, this really rich guy, her name is Raquel, and she sees Akiva with the sheep, with their father's sheep, and she has an eye for him. He's really a hunk, apparently, when he was younger. So she approaches him, they talk, and some romance starts to happen. Of course, she hides this from her father, who is a bit of an elitist, and would never allow her to have a romance with Am Haaretz, right? But nonetheless, as we know, when your heart knows, it knows. So she goes after Akiva, and Akiva responds, and he really likes her. But she says at some point when it starts getting serious, you have to really, because he had started on his spiritual path, You have to really get serious about your spiritual path if you want, because she was a very spiritual, Raquel. You want me to be your wife. So long story short, he does marry her. Savua finds it out. He disinherits Raquel because he's pissed. And she continues to love Akiva, and Akiva continues to love her. So he takes her seriously, and he enrolls. He's in this place in Israel, Lord. It's like just I think north of Netanya. I mean, maybe Philip would know where it is more than I would, but it doesn't matter. He goes to a local shul, I guess you would call it, and studies with a Rabbi Eleazar, who is studying the Aleph Bet in a children's OTO class. So the first thing I mean, he knows the alphabet, but what he's learning is the mystical understanding of the Aleph Bet, right? So I think this is a beautiful critical thing, right? Studying with Rabbi Eleazar. And he's 40 years old at the time. He's with 8-year-old kids in the class. Doesn't care, loves it, soaks it all up. As a matter of fact, he becomes a famous rabbi, becomes a student of Rabbi Yehoshua, and he's very keen intellect. He never associated the word rabbi with anyone else, not even Yehoshua, except for Rabbi Eleazar, his first teacher. And when he was giving dissertations on the Torah, he would always start with taking the letters and their energies and making that as part of his lesson. So this was something that was very important to him. Anyway, he's living in a cabin. They sleep on hay, and somebody comes to the door. They're very poor, obviously, and says, my wife is getting ready to have a baby, and we're out of hay, and we need your help, and she needs something to lay on. So Akiva says, take our hay. And Raquel's the same way. Very, very generous, even though they have nothing. Turns out it was Elijah testing him, right? So after this happens, pardon me if I go, I really love this stuff. It means a lot to me, and I'm maybe getting a little bit sidetracked. But she says, you should go away and be studied seriously. This is where he sets up to go with Rabbi Yehoshua, and he goes away for 12 years. Now, that's another number that historians say these mystics are using their numerology, so we don't know. The important thing is, the intention of it in the instruction we're getting. So he goes away for 12 years. He's so sharp, he rises right to the top of the wall of scholars. People start following him. By the time he comes back, he's 12,000 students. But during the time he was gone, Raquel was being convinced. She wasn't being convinced. They were trying to convince her that she should get rid of this fascination with Akiva, go back to her father, live richly, and marry higher up, divorce this guy. And he gets wind. She said that her response to that was, I would never divorce him. And as a matter of fact, if he went back for another 12 years, I'd be happy. He hears about this on his way back home, decides, you know what? She's right. I'm going back for another 12 years. After that period of time, he now has 24,000 students when he finally comes back. So he comes back, and Savua now is like, oh man, I made a mistake. And he welcomes him, he brings them back into the fold, and suddenly they have resources and things are looking up. But they're not looking up with the Romans. Anyway, there were 2 serious wars with the Romans. The last one was the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The temple was destroyed. The people went into diaspora, and sadly, Akiva met his end in I won't even tell you how he met his end. It wasn't nice because we're going to be meditating and I want you to have thoughts of torture and stuff. But on his lips, the last thing he said was the first word of the Shema, which the first letter of the Shema, the first sentence. As we all know, the last word is echad, which is oneness. And that brings me to the next story. So the real important story here, so that's all the context, right? The real important story here is what is called padres. And I love that word because padres sounds so Sephardic to me. And I kind of lean myself into that. But it's spelled Pei, Dalet Resh, not Shin, but Samach. Right? So it means orchard. So it happens somewhere between the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba rebellion. He and three of his, well, maybe you could say they were students of his. That's not certain. Maybe we would say peers who are mystics, meditate together, pray together, studies Torah together, decide to meditate on the holy names, and particularly Yud He Vav He, with the kavanah of entering the supernal world. So here we come back full circle to the battlefield of consciousness, right? Every time I tell the story, I forget the names of the other three rabbis. So I wrote it down this time. So I give them their due credit, right? So anyway, Padres. It's in the Talmud. It's talked about in other places as well. So they get together, they meditate. Rashi says they were meditating on the name, particularly Yud He Vav He. So I'm making it up because I'm a meditation teacher. With this kavanah intention. So if we think very simply, and this is simplifying things that have many levels. If we think of three levels, we can think of the absolute in Sof as pure consciousness that we can't even describe as one level. Then the unseen supernal world. So most of us don't go around seeing that world. The levels of heaven we're talking about, right? And then the relative that we all see all the time if we have eyes to see. So where they're going, their intention with using these names is that these curtains will be open and the unseen will be seen and the supernal world will be revealed to them. So Akiva sort of puts this thing together and he warns his three brothers. He says to them, when we go there, because it wasn't his first trip, you'll see these beautiful marble stones. Don't say water, water. Okay, so what the heck are you talking about? Well, the stones relate to the name itself, Yud He Vav He, right? And Yud He Vav He, the Aleph is really made of two Yuds, a Yud on the top, a Yud on the bottom, and a Vav in the middle. Okay, so what is he saying? Well, there's 2 points that I want to glean from this, right? Going in. I want to mention the names of the rabbis first. If I can find where I wrote them down. Okay. Ben Azzi, transliteration is Azzi. Ben Zoma, Zoma. Echer, which was a given name to him because he became the other, and I'll explain that. His real name was Elisha ben Avua. Now you can see why I forgot these names. So you got that Ben Azzi, Ben Zoma, Acher, which is Elisha ben Avua. So Unfortunately, his brothers didn't take his advice or didn't understand his advice, right? So Akiva, one of these guys saw when the curtain was open, he saw the supernal world. He looked and immediately died. One looked and was harmed mentally. So some say he went completely nuts. Others say that he just never got out of sort of the mystical realm and he couldn't really deal in practicalities anymore, but not a good thing. And Acher, who was Elisha ben Avua, he started cutting down. It says he was cutting down the trees and the branches and in the orchard. So that was the worst one. He became apostate. So he went to the Roman side. Um, so why did this happen, and how does it relate to the battlefield of consciousness? Two major things. One is separation. So this is why Akiva says, when you see the marble stones, you see Yud, when you see Yud He Vav, don't say water, water. He's referring to the waters above and the waters below. That division. He's also referring to any division in Yud He Vav He, because the purpose of our using these names, and the Zohar says, for the sake of the unification of the Holy One, blessed be He, and His divine presence, with reverence and love and reverence, to unify Yud He with Vav He in a perfect union. This is the purpose. So if you're going to walk in and start identifying separateness, that takes you out of the field of pure consciousness into a relative conscious thinking level field. So this is relative to our battlefield of consciousness. The basis of that, the second point, which relates to the first, is deeply connected, is unity and diversity, right? So what we have a diverse creation. But the illusion of that diverse creation is that it means duality. So the essence, and as I've said many times, what we do here is about engaging the essence. The essence is not duality, it's unity, even though it expresses itself in diversity. So really, the waters above and the waters below are one in their essence, right? So they see all this diversity. And the story goes, and I'll just say it, you can relate it however you want. They see all of these archangels and angels, and they see Metatron sitting on a throne. And their narratives this experience of the orchard does not compute with their narratives, right? Their narratives are, this looks like multiple gods. So one just faints and dies, and the other goes a little crazy. And one starts chopping things that he sees down with a sword. And it's said that the one who, Echer, who's chopping things down, literally the meaning is that he's separating Hakma, consciousness, that he's experiencing from all the other things. in his effort to come back to his own narrative. And when he fails in doing so, he becomes apostate. He's like, the Romans are right all along. There's multiple gods. Maybe Caligula is a god. I don't know. Whatever he says, he becomes apostate. Here's the key to putting this all together. The Talmud says Akiva went in shalom and came out in shalom, went up in shalom and came down in shalom. Right? So he engaged the essence, the unity in his peace, and that's how he entered the orchard. And that's how he stayed. So he observed. So when we're meditating, how many times have I told you? Just observe. Just be that witness. Thoughts, I don't care about thoughts. Visions, beautiful, have them. Prophecies, have them. You stay in shalom. You stay connected to that essence when going in and when coming out. Unified field of pure consciousness. That's the essence of all these things. That's why Akiva was successful. So in the real world, not just in our meditations, we see that the essence of everything is one, even though we experience it in duality. And I want to bring the sectarian piece back, because within all of the diversity, there is unity when there is an understanding, when we are all touching that pure consciousness. We naturally have respect for the other, for the diversity, right? So there's another sad story, a piece of this, and I'll conclude. There was you could call it a lot of different things. We're used to using the word pandemic these days, but during this period of time, there was a bad pandemic, or they call it a plague, in the world of action, and many people were killed, not just Jews died, but in Akiva's group, nearly all of his disciples died, except for 5. You're talking about 24,000 down to 5. So there was a lot of introspection. Why did God allow this to happen to us? You know, all of that you would imagine, you could imagine happening, right? And his conclusion was, in our diversity, we lost respect for one another. See, it's okay to think differently, but it's not okay to disrespect and dishonor one another. Because then that flow of unified consciousness is damaged. And when the flow of unified consciousness is damaged, there's just natural law consequences to it. And that's the way it is. It's not like some divine dude in the sky saying, oh, you light a candle on Shabbat, boom, you get the plague. This is just like you go to a power plant, a nuclear power plant, and the guy tells you there, okay, wear this suit. I don't need to wear the suit. I know, I have my own armor. And you don't feel anything at first. And then a couple of months later, you're dying. It's just natural law. You eat glass, eventually you're going to suffer from eating glass. So this is what Akiva felt. What's the point of this? The point of this is we continue to do on the battlefield of consciousness, engage unity, have intentionally coming out of meditation and prayer, zedukah, and all that we do, study, we intentionally seek to experience that essence in one another, not just here on this Zoom, but our neighbors and friends and strangers and everything, because the essence of it all is one. That's how Akiva went in peace and came out in peace. So next week, we'll talk about his disciple, Shimon Bar Yochai, and bring all these things together through his experience with his son in the cave.